Have you ever wondered what it truly means to be the one who built everything, only to be treated like you never mattered? My name is Wesley Roy. I'm 44 years old. And a few months ago I sat across from my stepmother and half-brother in a quiet legal office while a lawyer calmly handed over control of my family's retail company, the one I helped build from a crumbling regional chain into a national powerhouse, to someone who couldn't tell you the difference between margin and markup. They smiled. I stayed silent. I stood up, nodded politely, and walked out. No shouting, no accusations. Just the sound of polished shoes on cold tile and a chapter in my life quietly closing behind me. What they didn't realize is, sometimes the person you ignore is the very one holding the keys to everything. This is not a story about revenge in the way you expect. It's about legacy, about trust, and about what happens when you quietly outgrow the people who underestimated you. If this kind of story resonates with you, even just a little hit, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe. Because this story, it doesn't end where they thought it would. It begins right here. My father, Derek Roy, used to say that success wasn't built in boardrooms, it was built in stockrooms. He believed in hands-on work, late nights, and face-to-face deals. And I believed in him. That's why at 19, fresh out of high school, I skipped the frat houses and MBA tracks and went straight to the back of a delivery truck with the Roy and Hartwell logo printed on my shirt. We had just 5 stores back then. Inventory was tracked on clipboards, and I knew every SKU by heart. I wasn't the heir to the empire. I was the guy mopping up after it closed, and I was proud of that. Over the next 2 decades, I helped turn that chain into a respected brand with 80-plus locations across 4 states. Not because I was lucky, but because I was reliable. When vendors got nervous, they called me. When suppliers needed terms renegotiated, I showed up. I spent weekends helping store managers redesign floor layouts and late nights rewriting broken procurement systems. I didn't wear suits. I wore steel-toe boots and kept an emergency toolkit in my trunk. I wasn't just managing stores, I was keeping the soul of the business intact. Then came Austin, my half-brother 9 years younger, born after my mother passed and Dad remarried. He was everything I wasn't: charismatic, well-spoken, polished. He went to Stanford, studied business, talked about scalability and user journey mapping. When he came back from college, Dad introduced him as the future. He was handed a title straight out of the gate: Chief Digital Growth Officer. I remember the moment like it was yesterday. He didn't even know how to log into our back-end POS system, but he already had an assistant. I didn't complain. I nodded, shook his hand, and offered to walk him through operations. But something changed. Lynette. My stepmother and Austin's mother started making subtle suggestions during family dinners that the business needed a younger vision, that I was too close to the day-to-day. She spoke in the language of polite poison, never overt, always suggestive. My father, who once sat with me every Friday to go over our logistics reports, began inviting Austin to those meetings instead. Austin would show up with pitch decks full of buzzwords, but no understanding of our vendor relationships or our frontline staff. I stayed focused on what mattered: performance, people, and loyalty. But I started noticing things. My approval rights on purchases were quietly limited. Key meetings were rescheduled without me. Senior staff began referring to Austin as the new face of Roy and Hartwell. The boardroom door, once open to my practical input, slowly began to shut. And I couldn't help but feel that the very things that built our success, grit, presence, consistency, were now considered outdated. It was like watching your own shadow being replaced by something flashier but far less real. And the worst part, I didn't even hate Austin for it. I understood his appeal. He was the future they could market. I was the past they preferred to forget. I just didn't think Dad would forget it too. Not after everything we'd been through, not after what we built together. But blood has a strange way of rewriting logic. And in this family, charm started to count more than commitment. It started with small shifts, almost invisible unless you knew what to look for. The first time I noticed something was off was during a quarterly supplier negotiation. I'd always handled those meetings. Suppliers trusted me because I'd stood with them through price hike shortages, even the chaos of the pandemic. But this time, I wasn't invited. Instead, I got a forwarded calendar invite from Austin's assistant with the subject line, Updated Distribution Strategy Review, led by Austin Roy. I told myself it was just a formality. Maybe he wanted to learn. But when I walked into the meeting, Austin was already talking about phasing out legacy partners and bringing in agile vendors with scalable terms. No acknowledgement of our 15-year relationship with Tanner Goods or the handshakes that built them. Just a cold slide deck and phrases he probably picked up from a LinkedIn webinar. Dad wasn't at that meeting. He was recovering from a minor surgery, and Lynette had been managing his schedule. That, too, had changed suddenly. My father was unavailable for our weekly check-ins. When I called, Lynette always answered first. He's resting, she'd say, or Austin already updated him. Around the same time, I noticed changes in our reporting structure. My direct access to finance reports was restricted. Expense approvals I used to sign off on now required dual authorization. The VP of Operations, someone I trained from the ground up, was reporting to Austin instead of me. And in staff meetings, Austin had started using phrases like, as we shift to a more tech-driven culture, or under our new management lens. New management. I was still there, still clocking in before sunrise, still walking stores, talking to staff solving problems in the aisles. But somehow, in the minds of the leadership, I'd already been demoted without a title change, without a conversation. Just silence. And that silence was louder than any boardroom announcement. The real punch to the gut came when I found out about the e-commerce pivot, a $3.5 million investment into an outsourced platform that Austin had championed. I'd raised concerns about logistics branding and fulfillment complexity, but those concerns were brushed aside. You don't understand online consumer behavior, Austin had said to me in front of the board. What he didn't realize was I understood our actual customers by name, by need, and by loyalty. When the platform launched, it flopped. Wrong SKUs, delays, customer complaints flooded in, but the fallout didn't fall on Austin. Instead, I got the blame for legacy system integration issues. It was clear now I wasn't just being phased out. I was being positioned as the reason for anything that went wrong. Still, I didn't speak up. I didn't push back. I watched, I listened, and in the quiet, I started planning. Because if there's one thing years of retail has taught me, it's that flash burns fast, but consistency builds legacy. And I was done being invisible in the very place I helped create. The betrayal didn't arrive with a dramatic explosion. It came in the form of thick legal paper and polished silence. Just 1 week after my father passed, I found myself seated at the Roy and Hartwell legal office in downtown Dallas, across from a corporate attorney I barely knew. Lynette was seated on one side, face composed, dressed in quiet luxury. Austin sat beside her, tapping his pen rhythmically against a leather-bound notebook like he already owned the place. The lawyer cleared his throat and began reading the will. As the words unfolded, I felt my stomach drop, not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. My name was barely mentioned. My stake in the company. 5%. No voting rights, no say in operations. Just a symbolic token. The rest control shares authority had been granted to Austin. Lynette, of course, retained legal power over key assets through a trust. I didn't speak. I didn't interrupt. I just stared at the folder, then slowly leaned back in the chair. The lawyer handed me a summary page to sign. I reached for the pen, paused, and signed without flinching. Not because I agreed, but because I finally understood. This wasn't sudden. This was orchestrated. Austin smiled at me, tight-lipped, almost pitiful. "We'll make sure you're taking care of Wes," he said, like I was some aging uncle being retired politely. I stood up, nodded, and walked out. Jessica, my cousin, and our former HR director caught up with me in the parking lot. Her eyes were red. "Wes, this isn't what your dad wanted. He always said you were the backbone." "Apparently backbone doesn't count for much," I replied, unlocking my truck. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I just drove. Back at the office, I went into Dad's old suite one last time before clearing out. That room still smelled like cedar and coffee. I ran my hand over his desk-open drawers and started organizing loose paperwork. And that's when I found it tucked beneath a stack of unused notepads. A handwritten note, unfinished, unsent, but in his handwriting. Wes, you've been the engine behind this business since you were a kid. I know this decision might seem unfair, but Austin needs this chance to stand on his own. You're strong enough to rebuild something if you have to. He's not strong enough to live in your shadow. That last line hit like a fist to the chest. He knew. He knew exactly what he was doing, robbing me of what I built and handing it to someone who couldn't handle the weight, and he justified it by calling it mercy. I read it 3 times before folding it back into the drawer, so that's what I was now, the one who didn't need help, the one they could hurt without consequence because he's strong. It wasn't just a business betrayal. It was a betrayal of trust, of years of sweat, loyalty, and sacrifice. And yet, I still didn't yell. I didn't tear the note. I just sat there, staring at the window, watching the trucks move in the loading dock below the very ones I used to unload myself 20 years ago. What they'd taken from me wasn't the company. It was the recognition, the honor, the legacy. But what they didn't understand was that loyalty isn't written into contracts. It's earned over years on cold mornings and long nights. And in that moment, I decided something that would change everything. If they believed I was strong enough to start over, maybe it was time I proved them right. The next morning, I arrived at the Roy and Hartwell headquarters at my usual time, 6:45 a.m. sharp. The lights were still off. The cleaning crew nodded at me like they always did. My badge still worked. My office still had my nameplate on the door. Nothing had changed on the outside, but everything inside me had shifted. I didn't make a scene. I didn't pack my things into boxes or send a dramatic goodbye email. I just sat at my desk, opened my laptop, and stared at the login screen a little longer than usual. A few hours later, I met with the operations team, walked the supply floor, and reviewed an ongoing issue with vendor scheduling like I had done every Tuesday for the past 15 years. But this time it felt different. Not like service, like closure. Later that afternoon, I returned to my garage at home and pulled down a storage box I hadn't touched in years. Inside were documents I'd filed away during one of the rough patches with the company, a season where I'd thought for just a moment about leaving. There it was, a business plan, a proposed name incorporation papers, Roy's End Retail Solutions. It had started as a mental escape, an idea I kept buried just in case things ever went too far, a name I once laughed at, half joke, half truth. But now it looked like a promise. I dusted it off, flipped through the old notes, and realized something strange. The idea still held up. It wasn't just salvageable, it was ready. The supplier contacts were still relevant. The warehouse site I had scouted back then was still available, cheaper now thanks to market dips. Everything I'd ever needed to begin again was already here. And so I didn't rage quit. I didn't send threats. I just began shifting mentally first, then strategically. Each moment I stayed at Roy and Hartwell now had a new purpose, not to serve their vision, but to observe their cracks. Because they thought the battle was won when I signed that paper. They thought silence meant surrender. But what they didn't realize is men like me don't explode. We evolve. And when we move without warning. It didn't take long for the cracks to show. From the outside, Roy and Hartwell still looked polished storefronts, freshly painted branding, slick investor newsletters, glowing with buzzwords like digital transformation and market leadership. But beneath the surface, I could feel the foundations shifting. Austin may have inherited the title, but he didn't understand the rhythm of the business, the quiet pulse that held it all together. The first sign came from one of our oldest vendors, Whiteleaf Logistics. They handled 1/3 of our store deliveries across state lines. One afternoon, I got a call from Greg, the company's regional director. "Wes," he said cautiously, "your brother's team sent over a new routing structure, completely unrealistic. They want to cut delivery time by 20% without increasing budget, and they're eliminating our fuel reimbursement clause. I stayed professional, but inside, I already knew what had happened. Austin was chasing savings he didn't understand. He saw contracts as math, not relationships. I thanked Greg and told him I'd look into it. But the damage was done. Within a week, 2 more long-term vendors called me directly confused by renegotiations they hadn't agreed to, alarmed by language they'd never seen in our agreements. Then came the store managers. Our Dallas flagship location, Store Bon, the original, lost its lease. A clerical oversight, apparently. Someone on Austin's new retail optimization task force had failed to renew the contract in time. I found out through a store manager's text, "Wes, what's happening? Are we shutting down?" Internally, chaos was brewing. Employees were whispering about unpaid overtime and delayed bonuses. Corporate meetings became tight-lipped affairs with agendas stripped of transparency. The warmth that once made Roy and Hartwell feel like a family-run business had cooled into something brittle and cold. Austin, meanwhile, was in full CEO mode, giving interviews to trade magazines, posting inspirational one-liners on social media, and calling himself a next-gen leader. What he didn't see, what he couldn't feel, was the subtle exodus already beginning. Veteran managers started quietly updating their resumes. Vendors began padding their invoices. And more clients started calling my personal phone again. "Wes, are you still there? Wes, who do we talk to now, Wes? What's going on with Roy and Hartwell?" I gave the same calm reply every time I'm not sure. "But I'm still here if you need anything." What Austin had never understood and never would is that in retail relationships are the real currency. Not brand logos, not tech stacks, not vanity metrics. It's knowing who to call when a shipment's late. It's remembering a supplier's kid just graduated high school. And without that, you don't have a business. You have a building waiting to fall. The night I officially revived Roy's End Retail Solutions, I didn't sleep. Not because I was anxious, but because my mind wouldn't stop turning. For the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about fixing someone else's mess. I was building something of my own. And it felt right. By sunrise, I'd made my first 5 phone calls. They weren't to investors or marketers. They were to people who mattered: suppliers, logistics, partners, and 3 regional managers I trusted with my life. Each call began the same way I'm starting something new, quietly, carefully. "If you're interested, I'd like you on board." I didn't have to sell anyone. Loyalty has its own gravity. By the end of the week, I had verbal commitments from 8 of our former key vendors, including Whiteleaf Logistics and Garrison Packaging, both of whom had grown tired of Austin's team rewriting terms like they were ordering from a menu. More importantly, I had a temporary warehouse space secured in Tulsa, about 2 miles from the distribution hub I once helped design. The lease was flexible, the location strategic, and the owner was an old contact who still remembered the day I helped him salvage a collapsed shipment during a storm back in 2010. I reactivated the business license, updated our EIN-filed banking paperwork, and began designing a pared-down version of the original company, but with better tech, smarter logistics, and a ruthless focus on client needs. We weren't going to be flashy. We were going to be reliable. Then came the twist. On Thursday, I got a call from someone I hadn't heard from in years, Devin Finch. He used to run Ridgeway Retail, one of our main competitors, until a private equity group bought them out and ran them into the ground. Devin had retired, but apparently he'd been watching the unraveling of Roy and Hartwell with quiet interest. "I heard you're doing something new," he said. "I've still got connections, Wes, distribution capital, even some leftover supplier networks. If you're serious, I'm in." He didn't ask for control or headlines, just a backseat and a piece of something real. Within days, Devin became my silent investor. Not flashy money, smart money. I spent nights rebuilding client files from memory payment schedules, freight timelines, preferences. I mapped out what I'd need to get our first store-ready shipments moving within 45 days. I pulled out an old notebook from the year we expanded into Oklahoma. In the margins, I'd written something a store manager once told me: You don't need to promise Big Wes. You just need to show up every time. That became the foundation of the new brand. No noise, no ego, just precision service and trust. On a chilly Monday morning, I emailed our first invoice. The subject line read, Roy's End Retail Solutions, Order Confirmation. It wasn't a huge shipment, just a small seasonal display for an independent store chain in Texas that used to be one of our best clients. But when I clicked send, I felt something shift. Not pride, not revenge, purpose. Roy and Hartwell had turned me into a ghost, but now I was becoming something else, something sharper, more focused. I didn't need their buildings. I didn't want their titles. I had something they never understood how to build trust, and that I realized was more powerful than any legacy they could sign away. Because loyalty doesn't live in paperwork. It lives in people. 2 weeks after quietly launching Roy's End Retail Solutions, I picked up the phone and called Austin. My tone was calm, measured, almost deferential. I've been thinking about what you said, I began, about considering other options. There was a pause, then, the soft rustling of papers on his end. Go on, he said, clearly curious. I'm planning to do some independent consulting. I continued, but I'd like to help during this transition phase. You've got some relationships that still run through me, clients who call my number when trucks are late or inventory's mislabeled. I could manage those accounts temporarily as a contractor. Silence. Then the click of his pen. He was calculating. I knew that sound. You're saying you'd represent Roy and Hartwell. Off the books, no on contract, clean, transparent. You pay me a percentage of the gross from the accounts I manage. That way the revenue continues without disruption and you focus on new initiatives. Win-win. He didn't like giving me a foothold, but he needed the relationships. And his ego wanted to believe I was stepping aside, not stepping ahead. What percentage? 20. That's high. Harrison & Co. alone brings in over $1 million annually. If they leave you, lose all of it. 20% of something is better than 100% of nothing. He agreed, not happily, but he agreed. Probably thought it was temporary. What he didn't realize was that this arrangement gave me legal and direct access to the heart of Roy and Hartwell's client base. And more than that, it gave me control over the narrative. On paper, I was a consultant. In practice, I became the bridge every client trusted to keep their business steady. Calls came to me. Invoices were reviewed by me. Deliveries were routed through systems I quietly redesigned for efficiency. Austin thought he'd outsourced his biggest liability. But what he'd actually done was fund the platform I was building beneath his feet. Every handshake, every meeting, every vendor update included a subtle message. If things ever change here, I'll let you know where I land. I wasn't stealing his clients. I was simply reminding them who'd shown up all those years when it mattered. And while Austin played CEO in press releases, I was slowly, methodically positioning the entire foundation of the business to shift one conversation at a time. It began with a phone call from Harrison & Co. on a Tuesday morning. I was in the middle of reviewing shipment logs when their operations director called me directly. Wes, he said, voice tight, we're officially pulling out. Austin just tried to implement a 15% rate hike and cancel our preferred terms without discussion. I didn't say much, just listened, nodded, and thanked him for the heads up. But I already knew the dominoes were falling. By the end of the week, 3 more clients had walked. Then 2 suppliers froze their accounts. Roy and Hartwell's cash flow tightened like a vice. Internally, employees began whispering about late paychecks and halted bonus programs. Jessica, still quietly loyal, texted me from the inside, payroll delayed. Managers panicking. He's blaming market adjustments. But it wasn't the market. It was him. Austin's leadership style was glossy on paper, but hollow in practice. He had no instinct for relationships, no understanding of field operations. He ran the company like a spreadsheet, ignoring the fact that in retail, loyalty isn't captured in rows and columns. It's earned across years of trust, of showing up, of listening when it's inconvenient. He began calling vendors demanding reevaluations, told long-term suppliers that their loyalty bonuses were outdated, One even called me half laughing, half panicked. He just asked if we'd be willing to rebid our own contract. What's going on over there? Then came the final blow. Cascade Distributors, our largest and most essential supplier, called to inform Austin that their next shipment was canceled. When he demanded an explanation, they simply said, "We're working with someone else now." That someone was me. Meanwhile, my operations team at Roy's End Retail Solutions had grown from 3 to 12. Every employee that had followed me worked double shifts without complaint. They believed in the mission, and more importantly, our clients were coming with us, quietly, efficiently, and without fuss. Austin, however, was unraveling. He'd spent months pushing a narrative of growth and modernization. Now store shelves were half-stocked, deliveries delayed, and internal morale in freefall. Store managers began resigning. Some walked out mid-shift. Then one afternoon, my phone rang. It was Austin. "Wes," he started, trying to sound calm, but already fraying at the edges, "we need to talk. This contractor setup isn't working. Our clients are leaving. Our suppliers are backing out. Something's wrong." I let the silence sit before answering. I've been managing those relationships just like we agreed. If they're choosing to work with other vendors, that's their decision. You've been sabotaging us. I've been doing exactly what you paid me to do, managing your clients. The fact that they no longer trust you, that's not sabotage, Austin. That's the market speaking. He didn't respond right away. I could feel the panic bleeding through the line. He finally asked, "What do you want?" "I don't want anything." "You got what Dad left you, ownership. But you're learning now that ownership isn't the same as leadership. And this business, it was never the buildings. It was never the brand. It was people, relationships, trust. And none of those transfer with a signature." I hung up the call. That afternoon, I walked out of my warehouse office and looked across the industrial park. I could still see the Roy and Hartwell logo across the highway fading under a gray sky. By the end of the month, I knew what would happen. The bank would call in their debt. Suppliers would file claims. Roy and Hartwell would collapse under the weight of its own arrogance. And all I had done was give people a better option. No threats, no schemes, just results. By early spring, Roy's End Retail Solutions had become more than just a backup plan. It was a thriving, living extension of everything Roy and Hartwell used to stand for. What began with a modest warehouse and a few loyal vendors had expanded into 4 regional hubs across Oklahoma and Texas. We didn't have flashy offices or big budget campaigns, but our phone lines were always busy, our shelves fully stocked, and our trucks running on time. Word spreads fast in this industry. Clients talk, vendors listen. And soon, the very businesses that once ignored our name were now calling to ask for quotes for meetings for solutions. They weren't just buying product, they were buying reliability. Internally, our team had grown to 25 full-time employees, most of whom came from Roy and Hartwell. Not because I poached them, but because they came looking for something they could believe in again. Our warehouse buzzed with the kind of energy I hadn't felt in years. Jokes between forklift operators, managers, solving problems on the fly, everyone knowing exactly why they were there and who they were building with. Then came something I hadn't expected. One morning, while walking the Tulsa warehouse with our new logistics supervisor, a sharp woman named Carla, who had left Roy and Hartwell after her bonus was canceled, I told her we'd be moving a portion of the Q3 profits into a special fund. "A bonus pool?" she asked. "Partly," I said, "but also something more." I decided to start a small business support program, a fund to help independent retailers who'd been squeezed out by corporate pricing wars and supply chain chaos. We'd use part of our earnings to help them stay afloat, fair terms, flexible deliveries, and even mentorship on how to rebuild sustainably. Carla paused, smiled, and nodded. "That's what this place is," she said. "It's what the old company should have been." I didn't say anything, but I felt it. She was right. Roy's End wasn't revenge anymore. It was restoration of values, of loyalty, of purpose. And across town, Roy and Hartwell, they'd filed for bankruptcy. Austin had quietly returned to Seattle, and Lynette was rumored to be liquidating assets through a shell company. But I wasn't watching them anymore. I had a team, a mission, and something rare in this business, a second chance to build it right. This time from the ground up. In the end, this wasn't just a story about a man losing a company. It was about what happens when people confuse ownership with leadership and how legacy can't be passed down like property. Legacy is earned in the early mornings, the long drives, the quiet loyalty that never makes headlines but holds everything together. Wesley Roy didn't fight fire with fire. He fought with discipline, silence, and precision. He didn't need to shout, threaten, or destroy. He simply outlasted the noise. And in doing so, he reminded us of something that today's business world often forgets: the most powerful revenge is rebuilding something better. If you've ever been overlooked, underestimated, or replaced, you already understand the quiet fire this story speaks to. Not the kind that rages, the kind that endures. Sometimes you don't have to burn bridges. You just have to build your own road and walk away. If this story meant something to you, take a moment to drop a comment like, "Some bridges are better left behind." It lets us know you're still here, still building. And if you haven't yet, consider subscribing. We share real stories with real weight, the kind worth listening to until the very end.